Welcome, everyone, to Dolls of Our Lives. This is the show where we're reliving the American Girl series book by book, except on Patreon, where we're taking on related content that we decide and you suggest. I'm Mary.
I'm Allison.
And we're so excited to be here today to talk about the new Brownie book.
Very excited. We are continuing our coverage of Claudie Wells by kind of going out into her world. And I know there's a lot of different things that we could cover. We wanted to cover something that was relatively recent and kind of new in the world of Claudie and Harlem Renaissance.
Absolutely. And it's a really unique historical artifact in a sense, like the original Brownie book. So we'll get into what that was and what the new Brownie book is adding to it or offering. But before we do that, let's kind of get into some recent pop culture. This will come out in a couple of days, let's hope. So what's been going on with you, Allison? What are you taking in?
We were recently asked, what we're watching. And I said, I'm sort of like accidentally watching sports or sports by osmosis because it's just hard to avoid things like the Super Bowl. It just kind of is everywhere. And someone joked that, the kind of siren song of millennial culture of having Little John and others and Ludacris come out with Usher and then have Beyonce releasing an album. I do think it was kind of the perfect storm of like, Taylor Swift is living out her, original eponymous album dreams of like dating a football star. We have Beyonce kind of like, giving everyone an unexpected drop in the middle of this. I'm very happy for Usher. I think Usher has been doing fine. But between all of this and news of like Ashanti's pregnancy, it just kind of feels like everything has come together perfectly.
Yeah, there's been a lot. And I want to even go back and talk about the Grammys because we didn't really get into that before, which I think is related to the Super Bowl because we had kind of parallel surprise drops where Taylor Swift gets to the Grammys, wins her first Grammy, and as if she was afraid it would be her last that night, she's like, by the way, I've been keeping a secret for 2 years. I'm going to drop this album, which is called The Tragic Poets Department, I think.
Tortured. It's based on a group chat name run by her ex, Joe.
Which is, yeah. So that happened.
We called this.
Yeah.
We called this because we have been saying that we have not had a true Declaration of Independence. We have July 2nd, but let's say July 4, 1776.
Sure. Yeah.
This date last year is when Taylor's friends started this chain of unfollowing of Joe Alwyn. Taylor Swift is releasing this album on an important anniversary date of battles in Massachusetts. She's obviously doing that deliberately. I think that she and Ben Affleck are just doing whatever they can behind the scenes for America 250.
They're doing a lot, I'll say that. And J-Lo, let's not forget, This Is Me Now, which is still, I'm almost speechless at that. I wish I was speechless, let's say that. But yeah, the Taylor Swift of it all happened first. And I'll say this, so then she goes backstage, air quotes, we know it was like Tree Paine or someone else, like an intern who drops the track list and the album cover. I'm concerned about this album. I'll just say that. The track lists are concerning. I think the name is corny and I'm worried because I sort of feel like she's repeating a pattern here of like 1989 where we almost have the squad culture coming back. I have a friend who has a deep conspiracy theory that like the NFL has paid Taylor Swift to date Travis Kelce and do all of this to get people interested in football and to make people forget the racism of the Chiefs' name and history. Now, while I don't know if that's true, I mean, there's just a lot there where it's like you have done this so many times and you've had 2 public relationships since the recording of that album or the breakup with Joe Alwyn. So I'm just kind of like, is there going to be a nuance here? Like, and you can we can debate whether or not you need to require growth of your artists. Like, I don't know. You might just like someone who puts out kind of the same sort of vibe every album. That's totally cool. But what is she doing?
I listened to, it was a paywalled episode, but I really recommend it. I listened to an episode of Nick Vile's podcast where he kind of covers different pop media things. And he said something that I found really fascinating. I actually listened to it twice to really kind of process what he was articulating about this particular album. And he makes a point with people that a lot of professional therapists make about people's patterns and like repeating and not always being able to see your own patterns clearly. And he made this argument that Taylor Swift is not just going back into like the social media and like publication gimmicks that she has done, but that this is her exact relationship pattern. And he speculated as to whether she will someday have a current relationship that supersedes her desire to release a really good album. And he immediately got pushback from one of his co-hosts, who is a huge Taylor Swift fan, who said she should never have to sacrifice her career for a relationship. And he said, that's not what I'm saying. He said, she is in what may or may not be a very healthy, very fulfilling relationship. And he was wondering what conversation, if any, she's had with Travis about the fact that she's about to drag out possibly situations that happened from 2 years ago and add it to the narrative, which is her pattern. And I'm not criticizing it, but it is.
Right. And I do want to be aware of like the gendered nature of like the attention put on her in this practice, because, you know, like when the Beatles broke up, like you could make the argument that their solo careers were basically commenting on that platonic breakup for the rest of some of their lives. And people not only were into that, they loved, you know, unpacking the Easter eggs and the references to some obscure like Beatles lore. So this is not just a Taylor Swift thing, but I sort of just wonder, like, is there I think part of the reason I liked Folklore and Evermore is that it seemed like she was taking on as a songwriter. And I do really admire her as a songwriter, you know, themes that were not necessarily like, and here's this guy who wronged me and, you know, what's going on. Like My Tears Ricochet, I think is such a beautiful song because it's about not just a breakup, but about like the grief and kind of the anger and like all these complicated emotions that go with that. And I don't know. I mean, I just kind of wonder, like, does she have to join her public life to her professional songwriting? Can she, you know, is the conversation she's having with Travis like, and just so you're aware, like, yeah, I'm doing this again with Joe, but I have moved on personally. Like, I am not going to be writing songs about you. You know, I'm going to take on this other tact after. I mean, if she did this album 2 years ago, what's she doing now? You know, like, I don't know. Maybe she's moved on to some completely other content. I don't know.
Well, I think it's not so much, you know, what is in the album is the fact that it fits with something that she has done many times. And Nick Viall and other people are just speculating, will that be something that she chooses very deliberately to break? And the truth is, none of us know her, right? Like, we don't actually know what her real motivations are. Right. I think her relationship with him is real. And I also think there's very little that we actually know about it, right? Seeing two excitable, extroverted people who are on adrenaline highs hug each other really doesn't like a relationship make for me. We don't know anything about it. Both of them do things that are extreme sports in different ways. And at the peak of their adrenaline rushes, we see them looking in love with each other. That's all we know.
That's all we know. And also, like, all of that theory presumes that she's aware of whatever patterns that she has. And I think, you know, I once had a therapist say to me, like, we repeat until we repair. So if she's not aware, you know, of whatever choices she's making in her private life, which you're right, like, we are only seeing like 5% of who she is as a person, then maybe, you know, she'll keep doing this or she'll keep doing it in a slightly different way. Like, who knows? But I mean, I think it's interesting. I'll definitely be listening. But yeah, I mean, I don't know. I do think their relationship is real and I think it's PR. And like, I think it's mutually beneficial. And that's fine. Like, I'm not in judgment of that. But I think it's interesting that within a week, we had Taylor at the Grammys doing a surprise drop of her new album and people being critical of that she was sort of like pulling focus. I don't actually care about that. I think that's fine. You can do that. I did think she ignored Celine Dion and that was not okay with me. I don't know if you saw that whole thing.
I think the angles were very strange. And I do think that people were right to sort of defend what some of the optics were. If people don't know this, Celine has stiff person syndrome. and apparently had very strict guidelines in terms of how people could interact with her for her to feel safe. I think what looked like maybe kind of unexpectedly little eye contact might have been an offshoot of the fact that like everyone had been informed not to rush up and hug her, right? That any kind of physical contact or even interaction had to be negotiated ahead of time.
Yeah, and I would understand that. And I think that's a generous reading. But I would also think she could acknowledge her with words and say, wow, Celine, like to get this award from you of all people, like what, this just adds or whatever. She brings lineups on stage. I'm just sort of like, there's a lot going on here. And I don't know what it means, but I think, she's a person. We can all give her grace. But all to say, like she did that. And then a week later at the Super Bowl, we have Beyonce through a Verizon ad dropping what appears to be part 2 of Renaissance, which will be the long rumored country album.
Yes.
Which I'm excited for. I mean, in every diva's life, there is a time when you turn to make a country album. We've seen Sheryl Crow do it. Not sure I would call her a diva. We all remember when Lady Gaga dropped Joanne and the iconic documentary 5'3". If you've not seen it, put your life on hold, go watch, with the pink cowboy hat. And now we have Beyonce, who teased this seemingly by wearing a cowboy hat to the Grammys.
I agree. I think you drop your news whenever you want it. I also think, again, when we talk about patterns, probably the best people in the world are being paid by both of these women and their teams to strategize this out, right? So there's the personal patterns that either of these people have. And then there's the fact that like all of this is very carefully contrived. Where mid-range celebrities get in trouble is trying to still manage their own image. None of this is accidental, right? As one of them actually says. I do think, though, you don't get to have a persona of being this media and relationship mastermind and then say, "Oh, she didn't think it through." Right? You don't get to have both. You're
Are you
one
saying
or
that
the
about
other,
Beyonce
right?
or Taylor Swift?
Taylor Swift. I think no one questions for a second that everything Beyonce does is completely calculated. Because very few times you've seen into her private life, rightfully so, it was completely on her terms. It's been very different.
Yeah, it's been very different. And I think it's interesting that like Taylor Swift's PR head, Tree Payne, has become kind of like a celeb in her own right. Like not necessarily on purpose, but everyone's aware of how much she relies on Tree Payne. She's her only client to manage Taylor's public persona. Beyonce obviously has like a whole army of people doing that as well, but it's interesting, like they're not as known, and Beyonce is much more locked down.
I think I've heard the argument too that when you're really famous, you never want people talking about your PR person.
Yeah, I wouldn't. I'd be like, like let's not even go there. I mean, putting them in conversation though with like Justin Timberlake, who's having seemingly a very hard time relaunching, doing a hard relaunch, hosting or being the musical guest on SNL and dropping a single. Like, I don't even know what to say. We all know how I feel about him. So I'm not I'm not an objective observer, but it's interesting to put that in conversation with this because you can kind of see like two people who are doing it well, like constantly navigating how they want to reemerge and shift their public persona, and someone else who wants to navigate coming out of, a perceived, a reimagining of his public persona that's very different from the years when he was more successful and really struggling to do that.
We're going to be talking about this more. We've already decided what our, March read will be, which is all about kind of tabloid culture and like treatment of women in the early 2000s. But yeah, I think there's this thing too of like, the more we can be led to believe that we really know these celebrities, the better a job their team is doing.
Yeah, and I think that's why pop culture is such a great way to understand history as well, because both of these disciplines or ways of like viewing the world rely on understanding kind of like different stories that are presented to us. And it's our job to interpret or parse the stories of who these people want us to believe they are, what they're doing. And, you can see it as a construction. So it's not just like, you know, Beyonce woke up one day and decided to make a country album. It's like there's a whole story of like how she wants to roll this out, and we will understand it as she wants us to understand it, which is different probably than the truth of whatever that decision was.
I just think Taylor Swift is trying to be, you know, what Gerald Ford was in 1976 for Julie. She's just trying to come out in front and saying like, I know I invited a lot of British people to my 4th of July parties, and that was a mistake, and I won't do that again.
Wow. Well, she also has that song that's like, Bye London, So Long London or whatever. It's like, wow, that's her American Revolution. She's like, peace, I'm out of here.
I do think anytime we see Florida with question marks, we should get nervous and excited.
Whoo. Also, LOML, all lowercase. It feels like very like attempting to be Gen Z culture, like... Which is fine. I mean, I can't navigate that myself, but more power to her if she can.
There is nothing more millennial than Taylor Swift. I do believe that.
She's like very millennial. We have to embrace her. We don't really have a choice. And yeah, I mean...
She loves a themed outfit. You know, she's dating another celebrity. I think there is something to the fact that we were, you know, also still a lot of us last summer, right? If you couldn't afford to go to one of her concerts, which is almost everyone on the planet, or you didn't get lucky, you know, somehow you watched her from a movie theater or from your phone screen or from a TV at home. And I think there are just saturation points with human beings that we reach, right? We're not supposed to worship her, but at a certain point, we reach a saturation point. And how many times do you watch a person win when so many other things in society are bad? And you either go all in on being very happy for that person or just respecting and appreciating that person, or some part of you. And I feel like culturally, this is that little 90-degree turn or 45-degree that people are starting to make to just feel resentment about other things spilling and being mapped over to her. I don't care if she makes an album about Joe Alwyn. That, like, I'm hoping that the music is good. But I think there is a point of, in a night designed for industry recognition, people who haven't had it so good, particularly the past 5 years, are going to project something onto that. Yeah, like my album went nowhere. Just kidding.
That's fair. Anne Helen Peterson wrote a really good piece in her newsletter Culture Study about this, about Taylor Swift and the good girl trap. And I think it's interesting reading the comments on the essay, because her point was, you know, when you're the most famous person in the world at a certain point, and you're kind like, people are mapping everything, like you're saying, that's going on in society onto this person. Like I could look at Taylor Swift and see like all the structural inequalities in our world that put her like largesse in greater contrast. But what was interesting was, like, basically Anne was saying there's stuff she's doing that isn't bad per se, but when you've been so good for so long, it's really hard to maintain that. So it was easier for Miley to emerge as this, like, you know, person who survived child stardom and the perils of that, and people were happy for her at the Grammys. Whereas with Taylor, it's like she's always been winning. She's never had a public meltdown. She hasn't had, like, Justin Timberlake, some news come out about the truth of her behavior behind the scenes. It seems to be in conflict with their public persona. So she's setting her up to, as kind of saying, like, culture will set people in this position up to fail because they can't possibly maintain this level of fame without somebody turning on them. And I think, to your point, like, the comments really called out her like the fact that she's a billionaire, and like there are no ethical billionaires. Like if you think that it's cool to have $1 billion, like you're probably like not understanding like how disruptive and how destructive that is to everyone else's situation. So it's like, I think we are seeing people, or will see people, turn on people who have that much money.
Would you have a private jet if you could, knowing your relationship with airplanes?
You know, I'm afraid to fly. If my brother would fly it, I would share one. I would do like a timeshare private jet. I mean, I know it's not great, but I mean, would I put a cease and desist on a person tracking my carbon emissions of my, you know, timeshare private jet, as Taylor Swift has done, without wanting to be publicized because it makes her look bad? No, I probably wouldn't do that. I mean, somebody should call me out. You know what I mean? Like,
Well, I used a paper straw last week, so we're kind of like, we're all set.
We're all on the same page here. Well, it's interesting, like people are calling Oprah out. Like Oprah has bought up so much land in Maui, and people, when she was like, everyone should donate to these poor people who had their lives ruined by the fires, people were like, why don't you give some land back? Like, why don't you do something that we all can't do because we're not billionaires? And it was like cricket. She was like, here's the rock. Like, you know what I mean? Like there's something going on where people who could kind of survive in public having so much money are losing some of their goodwill. Like, it's interesting. Like, I'm kind of curious where this is going.
In a lot of ways, this does really dovetail with the issues that we've been thinking about, because we've read both Claudie books at this point. So if you listen to things kind of in a different order, we've now read both of her books. And at the heart of what we're going to talk about today is a project by one of the architects of kind of like the modern uplift movement, particularly with relation to the talented 10th, right? This idea that if you have highly successful people to look up to, these kinds of models of wealth, intelligence, beauty, everything. Clearly, I'm, model speaking here. Beauty, I can't say it right. But if you have these models to look up to, you have something aspirational in society. And W.E.B. Du Bois, who created the baseline for what we read for this particular episode, that was a firm belief of his, right? And you can map that on to discourse today where people say, Beyonce serves basically a societal function by being an example of a top percentage of wealth and excellence. That argument has been made over and over.
Right, exactly. And part of her appeal is that not everyone can be like Beyonce.
Right.
So it's not that like she's so accessible and it's like, well, if she's doing that, I should be like her. I mean, there are people who are watching Beyonce thinking that. I think like, wow, how lucky am I to live on the planet at the same time as Beyonce and Dolly Parton? Like that's, to me, they're so unattainable. Like they're in outer space. But yeah, I mean, so she fits into that talented 10th category definitively.
Do you think that if Claudie were at the Super Bowl, do you think she would be reacting to Taylor Swift and the Kelseys, or do you think she only cares about, the Beyonce drop and Usher? Like, where do you think she is culturally?
I think she would be like at home watching with her book club and interested in supporting Usher and pleasantly surprised by the Beyonce drop. I don't think she would be aware of Taylor Swift. That's just, or like Taylor Swift would be on her radar, but like not super important to her. That's just a guess.
She's over 100, but she respects Usher. I loved reading where people are talking about how you could visibly see Usher sweating.
Yeah.
And the value of seeing a performer actually sing, not hitting everything just perfectly because they're not using an auto-tune pre-recording, but like really dancing and giving it their all and kind of putting in for a free performance, right? Like they're not being paid anything, something really excellent. And then to know that all of your efforts are trumped by Beyonce, who's like waving from the stands.
Yeah, drinking a beer. Yeah, it's amazing. That is amazing. If you do want to be amazed, like I do think like Usher is someone who has like quietly done the work his whole career. And like somebody tweeted last night, like we are all Kiki Palmer because she's such a huge Usher stan. That was like, we're all happy for her. If you watch his Tiny Desk, like you can really hear him more clearly singing, and he still sounds great. And in some ways, like I prefer that to what he did in the Super Bowl because you can kind of hear him better. But at the same time, it's like seeing him dance and like really work, like the level of fitness of that man, I can't even fathom.
We don't need to. It's okay. We have Usher too.
Yeah, we have Usher. It's fine.
Be the model of excellence. So the book that we chose to read came out in October of 2023, and we can talk more about this, but it's definitely, I think, a product of like the years of 2020 to 2022. Mm-hmm. There's a lot in here, and it's technically called The New Brownies Book, A Love Letter to Black Families. It was organized by Dr. Karida L. Brown and Charly Palmer, but it is inspired by Du Bois's original Brownies Book periodical.
Yes, which the original Brownies book was part of the Crisis, which there was a yearly children's issue of the Crisis, and it began in October 1919.
You can actually find a full run of the Brownies book if you go onto the Library of Congress website, and we can include a link in that. There were various editions of the Brownies book between 1920 and 1922. And at their peak, they reached about 5,000 people. The goal was to reach Black Americans. Just for reference, there were 10.5 million Black Americans in the whole country at that time, which I think makes the 5,000 number more impressive. And literacy rates were at about 24% among that population. And there was a big divide between older and younger people. So older people actually closer to Du Bois's age, there's still fairly high illiteracy rates. And then among younger people, the literacy rates were going up much faster, kind of post-Reconstruction. And this is trying to reach that generation. So kids who are exactly Claudie's age, born in the early 20th century.
Absolutely. I mean, what do you make of this project before we get into the content of like kind of reimagining this really singular, I want like magazine, let's say, that ran through, I think, 1921. As someone who's kind of familiar with the history, like, can you give us the more context or different context for how you kind of entered this book?
So when we first started talking about how we would add material to accompany the Claudie stories, we thought about a lot of different things. We could read a children's book from that era. We could read Zora Neale Hurston. We could go in many different directions. But one of the books that I've loved that we covered on this show was the Dear Highlights book that talked about the history of children writing into highlights. The American Girl magazine was a really big deal for you, and I was a big magazine reader. And I like thinking about over the past 100 years, what's been available for children to read. And the Brownies book really had no peer. And one of the next closest books, magazine series that runs that is similar to this is Ebony Jr., which comes out in the mid 1970s. But just for your kind of reference, if you got a subscription to the Brownies book in the early 1920s, it was $1.50 for an entire year, which today would be like $47 for an annual subscription, which is really good.
It's a good deal. Yeah.
It's a very good deal.
I mean, it's interesting to think about understanding historical eras through the experience of children, which like may sound obvious because of the premise of our show and American Girl and so on. But when you think about like this as something for children in the time, and then also think about what it can mean to us as historians or people interested in the past, like it's such an incredible archive because it includes content submitted by children and written by, you know, people who go on to be quite prominent, like Ralph Ellison and others, or Langston Hughes, who, you know, become very prominent, but are starting out like writing directly for kids. It's kind of incredible.
The early editions, which again, you can see on Library of Congress, have a lot of pictures. They're meant to be very visual to reach young people where they are. They have fantastical stories, illustrations. They have line notes for songs. You can play music from the Brownies book. They have really just like so many pictures. That's hard to underestimate. And the new Brownies book is highly visual as well. Has a number of essays, but it also has a lot of collage projects. It has different paintings and other kind of media inside of here. But the goal with the Brownies book was you could take a child like Claudie, and Claudie actually mentions reading it in the book. We can talk about that passage, and give them both heroes, so people who are kind of at the highest peak of success in society, and closer role models, right? So kind of mirrors that they can look into of children who are highly creative and successful enough to get into the Brownies book.
Yeah, and I think like that gets back to a really core piece of the Harlem Renaissance, which was not only kind of imagining like a newer like Black culture, more prominent, but at the same time, like part of that was, you know, recording the histories of Black people, like representing like Black people have a history, have a culture. And in the list of reasons why, you know, Du Bois and others create the True Brownies, or he lists something called the True Brownies goals. There are 7 goals. One of them I think is interesting is to make them know that other colored children have grown into beautiful, useful, and famous persons, followed by to teach them a delicate code of honor and action in their relations with white children. So I think in those 2 points, you can see why this is uniquely targeted to Black children, not only, and I think primarily to create a sense of pride in their history, but also like as a how-to, like how do you navigate the world in which white supremacy is shaping a lot of your daily experiences or choices.
We discussed this on our last Claudie episode, but that's also striking a different note than what we could basically call separatists are arguing for by the 1920s, when veterans, particularly like Claudie's father, he would be considered in this category, come back and are still treated absolutely horribly by most of society, and white society in particular. There are people who spend decades trying to argue again, basically for repatriation, that within the Black community, there should be a movement to leave the United States, right? That it will never be safe, it will be hostile. And particularly after things like the Tulsa massacre or, the attacks on Black Wall Street, there are people who are arguing that there can't be peaceful coexistence. And Du Bois and others he changes throughout his lifetime, but this is an argument for promoting Black excellence, but also integration, right? That societies don't have to live apart. Just for folks' reference, he's in his 50s when he's working on this project, so he's extremely well established. He's already written big histories on Black culture in the United States, including one on Reconstruction, the era that he grows up in. And he'll live until 1963, but he ends up moving to Ghana later in life. So he really runs the whole gamut from trying to find ways to, I don't even want to say reconcile, but coexist, to eventually leaving the country himself after the kind of early years of the civil rights movement.
Right. And like he gets the first Black person to obtain a PhD from Harvard as a young man. And then, as you're saying, over the course of his lifetime, he goes from someone who wants to coexist to when he's in Ghana. At that point, he's almost a segregationist at that point, would you say?
He's definitely more radical. I mean, he's among the people who is considered, successful by even white supremacists, right? Because he goes to Harvard, he's writing books that are kind of for a mainstream establishment. The Brownies book is something that's lauded by a number of people because it's not challenging the status quo in the ways that other kind of more radical activists are going to in the decades to come. But you have to imagine someone born, right after the end of the Civil War. He lived through tremendous social change, but also experienced the same kinds of horrible racism decade after decade. So he lives to be 95 years old, and racism in that era is still, just as painful as it was growing up during Reconstruction.
Absolutely. And I think that the clause about, how to live in white culture and coexist, it puts into interesting conversation the content of the new Brownies book, because I was really struck by a short story in the new Brownies book by a father writing to his Black daughter about, like having what parents call like the talk, or like how he anticipated or anticipates with sadness eventually having to have that talk with her younger brother, but is sort of like, as a Black parent or a father, how do I prepare, like how are the needs of Black girls different from the needs of Black boys?
This book, on the surface of it, and we should say this is organized by Dr. Karida Brown, who is a professor and has written a number of books on Du Bois and other topics, and the artist Charly Palmer. It's divided into sections, and something I kept thinking about, the Brownies book obviously comes out of conversations happening among adults, right, about the future of race and racism. Do you think, and I do believe that the Brownies book was for children and resonated with children in the way that American Girl and Highlights and Ranger Rick resonate with children. This is a love letter to families. And I think this book is not pretending to be for children, even though parts of it could be given to children. I think this does something very different by not trying to be a product with children really actually in mind.
Yeah, I almost think that, like, as I was reading this, and particularly that piece, which is called Time Capsules by Lawrence Ralph, which appears in the first chapter, which is called Family Ties. It sort of reminds me of a zine in a sense, or like a homemade magazine, where the act of writing the thing or making the thing is as important, if not more so, than sharing out that thing or imagining your audience. Like, I almost think that for Lawrence Ralph, like writing this piece directed to his daughter Amina is more important as like something for him to process. Like, how as a parent do I think about the needs of my Black daughter in terms of how to prepare her for, like white society, like all of this kind of stuff, than actually writing something for his daughter Amina, if that makes sense.
There are many parts of this book that I could see, multiple generations gathering around to enjoy and appreciate it. Again, it's an homage to the Brownies book. It's not an exact copy. I did find on Instagram that there is someone who is selling subscriptions to something that is a new Brownies book that is directly modeled on Du Bois's work and the other contributors. This is very much meant, as you're saying, like spark conversations and be a creative process. Each section offers you something distinctive. So in some parts, there's a lot more collage and visual media. One of my favorite parts was the section of basically like encyclopedia entries about prominent Black figures that some people may not have heard of, and some people who are more prominent. You can take a little quiz towards the back of the book. A lot of this is like family conversations happening amongst people put into either a visual format or an essay. This book, I think, also really shows what's happened in the years since the 1920s, because there's so much in here about the development and growth of historically Black colleges and universities. And I think this is kind of like what was reaped by the people who sowed everything in the Brownies book. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yes, it does. And like there's a chapter called School Days, which is like, okay, so what ends up happening at HCBUs? Like, what is the experience of students there? There's like, it seems like a lot of students from Fisk are writing either like excerpts of plays. There's an entire excerpt or chapter that's Langston Hughes poems from the original Brownies book, kind of just reprinted, which is interesting. Poems by current, kids writing poems or about their experiences. I really thought the chapter We Were Kings was interesting because there's like this essay that's like, what if, or it's a poem that's like, what if Martin Luther King Jr. like had been part of hip hop culture? Like, what if he was born now? Would we believe him? Which reminds me of like growing up in Catholic school where people were like, what if Jesus came today? Like, what if he had a skateboard? Would you respect him? And it's like, it kind of gets into like the respectability politics within the Black community. Like, you probably remember when Bill Cosby was like giving talks at Morehouse that were like very shaming of Black, like young Black people. But it gets into like, can you just be part of the culture and still be respected? You know what I mean? Like, that's how much things have changed since the original Brownie book. Like, hip hop has happened. All of these other cultural moments have happened. And can we still like find the core of the movement within all these other movements?
I love the section called Young Langston, as you're saying, like getting to read real material that was originally published for children so long ago. And I think something that connects, right, is that the whole book is very creative. Even the sections that are more straight encyclopedia articles, that's a section called Shiro's. Everything is presented in a way that is dynamic, right? You want to keep reading, you want to keep coming back to this as a reference. And to me, the design is, instead of handing someone a new version of the Brownies book, you're gathering around the book and you're asking questions of each other. Like, so when was Fisk first opened? Who are these people who were trained by Du Bois? And if you're going to flip to a section of the book, We Were Kings is where they kind of talk about the different inheritances of Martin Luther King Jr. I also loved a section by Damon Young, A Letter to the Kid Who Eventually Breaks My World Record of Most Bite-Sized Snickers Eaten by a 12-year-old in the 13-minute span while waiting between pickup basketball games at Mellon Park. This book is also fun in certain ways, and I think that's really paying tribute to the kind of like interesting and silly aspects that were baked into Brownie's book too.
Yeah, I agree on that. And I also think like there's a lot of attention to like generational differences or like inviting like kids to read this with other family members. There's an essay, it's later in the book, I can't remember what the name of it is, but it's about It talks about a girl who's like, you know, in conversation with like other women in the family and how they're all different, and like how that like she and her mom will exchange like looks and laughs because like their great aunt doesn't understand the internet and like technology. And it's like, that's relatable probably to a lot of people reading it. And that's kind of just like the fun of like situating yourself in your longer family history. And I think like having those moments of fun throughout is really important to navigating like what must be real heaviness as a person of color reading this book in other ways as well. Obviously that you and I was not part of our reading experience as white people, but yeah, I'd imagine that was like a very thoughtful choice in terms of like how you experience the book moving through it.
The New York Times did an interview with Dr. Brown and other contributors to the book, and they talked about what directly inspired it. And they talked about specifically like events of 2020. And one of them said, I had just witnessed George Floyd being murdered on TV and Breonna Taylor. And I thought, if I'm feeling this level of despair, what must a Black child feel? And you can see direct reactions and tributes to those people and others. And when you think back to the Claudie books, or even if you haven't read them, very specifically, she has a moment where she thinks about the NAACP flags in her community that are notifying her that a person was lynched. And her mother, who is in the world of journalism and has provided her with Brownies books, wants her to be aware, but also doesn't want her to have to carry, right, every news story and have to carry the full despair and weight of it, which is why I think this is a mixed media book. I should say there is a centennial celebration that was put out in 2022 of the original Brownies book, and it's essays, but it is completely different from producing a love letter, right? Those two things are just different planets.
Yeah, like I think it would lessen its value or its power if we didn't have like the multimedia experience here of like the cartoons that are through here, the comics of like a girl watching George Floyd coverage with her parents, or the Ferguson protests and being like, oh my God, like I'm terrified to be Black. And then they're like, no, being Black is amazing. And, you know, like having this connection moment that is so much more powerful when you literally see the story play out with comics. And also just the art through this book. My God, the art in this book is absolutely gorgeous. And I just found myself going back to paintings and collage work and just staring. I mean, I read it on a Kindle. I know you have like the coffee table book, but even still, it was absolutely beautiful.
It's very thick. It's a very well produced book. And again, thinking of this as being a legacy project, the goal is to create something that is worthwhile, that's worth owning, that you're proud to have. And it made me think about, you know, the beautiful production of early American Girl books and kind of pricing all of this out. I looked through some 90s catalogs, and the original books were about $5. Obviously, with inflation, that would be a little bit different today. But you see over and over, whether it's Ebony Jr., all these kinds of publications trying to make this so that people can really earnestly afford it. And when you read like Du Bois and others, they wanted people to have access to this. It wasn't meant to be an elite publication. It was meant to be aspirational and accessible.
Yeah, which is interesting that like, does it matter that something that's meant to be almost like not long lasting, because a lot of periodicals, you know, don't survive, like into a coffee table book? Like, I wonder if they thought about that, like the shift from the material, like nature of this object from like, you know, different editions on probably cheap paper to like what looks like a beautiful coffee table book.
You'd also have to think, right, there's still plenty of children who are selling periodicals and newspapers on streets at this time.
Right.
Even though it's more regulated. And something I hadn't really known about the Brownies book, we learned about it in the past. It's always referenced, right? People pull out Langston Hughes poems. Even in the earliest editions, there are photographs of Black children at work. And you don't often see that, right? You see a lot of Lewis Hine photos or other imagery of really sort of like white children who are in industrial settings. And one of the very first editions, you see a Black child working in an industrial setting in the South. And you have to imagine for someone like Claudie, that's new information.
Right. Well, and I would love to do like a readership study of like where does this reach in the country? Like, is it like how many like kids in rural settings are reading this as well? Like, and kind of just getting a sense of like being a tourist in other kids' lives. Because I remember reading things like Weekly Reader and things like that. And it was really interesting to me to see pictures of kids who lived in other parts of the country and just like what their families looked like. And American Girl magazine was like this too. So I wonder, like, even for kids, like Black kids in the country at that point, like, where are a lot of the readers found? Is it mostly like an urban readership where they have access to things like more periodicals? You know, where and how is it traveling?
If you read one of the American Girl essays, they talk about the fact that, you know, Claudie is basically manifest from all different qualities that are put in the Brownies book, right? She is who they imagine was the primary target audience. And I hadn't remembered this, you know, even though we just read it last year. Claudie's experience of reading the Brownies book is sort of a mixed one. And I'll share the little passage. We get, you know, a very kind of like typical American Girl. Like they tell us what the Brownies book is. Children's magazine published by W.E.B. Du Bois, a great Harlemite himself. He published a magazine for grown-ups called The Crisis, but Claudie loved the Brownies book because of its stories, poems, and illustrations. But she's sad because she's feeling like she is not going to be successful in what she wants to do. And the passage continues, that afternoon, even the Brownies book couldn't cheer her up. She was reading about great colored heroes who had accomplished extraordinary things, and she couldn't even make it through a dance routine without embarrassing herself. And so even this character who's meant to be really sort of this manifestation of all of these values and important moments in the flourishing of the Harlem Renaissance, I think this points to something important that Britt Bennett is excellent at. She's not an archetype. She's not just kind of like a paper doll figure. She's a real person who's now kind of had this document put in front of her about Black excellence, and she is worried she won't measure up.
Yeah, and I think that's such a relatable thing to kids too, like especially when you read like the encyclopedia entries, like it's intimidating to be like, wow, look at what all these amazing people did in their lives. Like I remember reading books like that and just be like, I mean, obviously growing up in a Catholic family, like we had a copy of Lives of the Saints and I was just like, wow, this is like unattainable. Like I have no idea how these people like do this kind of thing. And it does make you feel small, like even as it is a window into other, you know, paths and experiences. I do think, you know, it's a really human moment to have it be intimidating for her as well. Like I do think something Britt Bennett and the editors of this book do well as well is to kind of reimagine the Harlem Renaissance as a global moment and not just localized to Harlem. And like you have references to, there's a story called 9 Nights reclaiming Caribbean bereavement during COVID, which is a really interesting essay about someone who grew up in a Caribbean family who, you know, practices before COVID, the experience of like being with family for 9 nights and like processing grief as a family over those days, and how the interruption of like COVID and not being able to be together in person changes those rituals, for better or for worse, like not being able to gather. And I found that really like interesting because that's not my heritage or experience. So I feel like I learned a lot. But it was cool to read like a Caribbean tradition into the Brownies book in the same way that I like that Britt Bennett read kind of the Great Migration as a global moment too into her location of the Harlem Renaissance or that history by having one of the boarding house residents be from, I think, Jamaica.
Both are giving you more than one person's experience, right? And kind of showing the complexity and internationalism of the Harlem Renaissance. And in both cases, I think it's this idea too. I know that we grew up and it became kind of a punchline, but children are the future, right? And I think today it's kind of like that tends to have a question mark on the end of it, or it's become something kind of like silly that when we've joked about it. But this idea really and truly that they're not just investing in the success of adults or in the case of Claudie's father, right, his reintegration into society after military service, or her mother being really exceptional in terms of her ability to get an education and have a career in journalism. But this idea that the future lies in Claudie as well, that her success really matters to the people around her. And a lot of scholarship on this, like uplifting the race, other studies have shown that did put pressure on people.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's a lot of pressure. And, it also is a way of like orienting your identity apart from the nation state, which I think like makes it feel really relevant to readers today too. Like if you're reading the Claudie books, where it doesn't feel as like prominent, I guess, right now, that many people are like, well, I'm an American first, or, like the nation state is an organizing principle. Like, I don't know where people are at with that, but I think like to identify yourself like amongst like Black tradition, I think that's a really relevant still concept. And the idea of like the pressure of that moment or that feeling, I imagine is probably still relevant too.
You think of the framing of the Brownies book as being for the children of the sun. It's this idea, as you're saying, that there is more to their collective identity than just like being from Harlem or just being from New York or the United States, right? That there's something pretty global to this. And what's hard, I think, to communicate over, a listening platform, I really do recommend that you check this book out, is just how striking it is. And I think really kind of paying tribute to the fact that whether you totally buy into this or not, like you can't be what you can't see. And so giving children, really good examples of Black art or African inspired art had a value in the 1920s and still has a value today. This isn't my world. This isn't my culture, right? But it's important to understand the experiences of other people. If I flip open a vintage Ranger Rick or a Highlights, or a Scholastic, I'm likely to see people whose lives are similar to mine. Flipping through the Ebony Jr. magazine or old Brownies book or even this book, I saw things that were completely different from my life.
Right. And that's, I love seeing that. But I also think, reading this book, I was reminded of that image of the little girl standing in front of the Michelle Obama portrait, which is not that long ago. I mean, comparatively, and this idea of like, you can't be what you can't see, and like how moving that was to her. And so I think there is still a lot of power in that idea. And I was really moved by the fact that there are references to bisexual people in the new Brownies book, to Lorraine Hansberry, who had private relationships with women. And that's something that, obviously was not in the original Brownies book and was really kept out of a lot of original Harlem Renaissance writing and histories, even though, like, as Henry Louis Gates and others have said, like, the Harlem Renaissance was as much a gay movement as a Black movement. Like, there are so many queer people at the center of it, including the Brownie book itself, which had a business partner who was fired by Du Bois, which he later said he regretted doing because he was arrested essentially for being gay. And, so it's really interesting to think about like that context and how far, it's really powerful that it's not made a big deal of in this book, but that there are references to gay people. Like, it was like, wow, like, I don't remember as a kid growing up, we just had a great conversation on the Gagey channel about a librarian there who's trying to recover, like, what's the earliest, children's book he read that had a reference to gay people. And I can't remember one at all. So, that was really on my mind reading this book as well.
Queering the Color Line is a really excellent, more academic study of this place and time. But to your idea, they make the point very early, right, that the Renaissance was queer as well as Black, right, and also multicultural and international.
Right.
And there's a lot of really fascinating examples of how what you think you might know about leading figures, you've been really misled because you didn't get this whole other aspect of their experience. There's also, within the kind of worlds of Claudie as created by American Girl, there's a lot of emphasis on Madam C.J. Walker and other people. And within those families, there are really important queer stories and histories that really haven't always been made part of the canon of that. And so within the next 5 years or so, as Claudie gets to know more people, that would absolutely be her world. That wouldn't be something separate, like living in a boarding house and being really part of a community. She would be meeting people all the time and getting ideas about what's possible for her life.
Yeah, absolutely. And she meets Langston Hughes at the end of book 2, and he comes to her show, and now like scholars are sort of revisiting, like, was he gay? Was he ace? Like, and the truth of his life is, less important to assign a label to him, but just to more open up the possibility that as you're noting, like it was such a queer movement and these folks would have been a part of her everyday life. But, you know, obviously the Britt Benny doesn't get into that, you know, in the story, it's not relevant, but it is interesting to think like at the show that she, you know, organizes at the end of book 2, like, you know, there were likely queer people there. There were likely people from all over the place there. And that's the point of, you know, Claudie's final act is like how many people have flown to Harlem for some, you know, variety of freedom they couldn't find where they came from.
It's sort of silly, right? And it's sort of a drop in to say, and Langston Hughes, right, attended, you know, this you know, sort of random child's boarding house. But we even discussed this on our main feed episode that it's a lot more credible when you understand the Harlem Renaissance and when you understand uplift movements of the time, the importance of having children in other parts of the country, for example, learn and memorize either the entire Bible or entire segments of the Bible, right? The idea that people would sacrifice their livelihoods to send a single child to an HBCU. It actually makes sense that even an up and coming important literary person would go to a boarding house review and fundraiser because it's about uplifting an entire group of people and not about like, well, I'm doing fine, so I'm not going to worry about other people. This actually does make sense. And even though the idea that it's like the actual poet of the Harlem Renaissance is there, I kind of like it because Britt Bennett does a great job of putting real people in. Whereas I think if Meet Felicity or Changes Felicity had a random appearance by a Paul Revere type, you really would kind of roll your eyes.
Or like Teddy Roosevelt shows up to the lake house.
It wouldn't make a lot of sense if Samantha just happens to run into certain people. But when you're in the world of Claudie, right, where class is thought about a little bit differently than in other parts of the country, she's going to interact with people who have a lot more privilege and a lot less privilege than her every day by virtue of segregation. I'm not trying to romanticize it, but she just is.
No, she definitely is. I also think it's a credit to Britt Bennett's writing that she has developed so many people in Claudie's world feel like fully fleshed out, even minor characters, that she kind of earns like the celebrity drop in at the end because it doesn't feel as like, and here's this random person that when you say their name, you know exactly who we're talking about because everyone else feels like very known at that point. Like they're almost like celebrities in Claudie's world. So it's like, okay, and here's another person that like I can locate within this world, as opposed to like a drop in who sometimes like when you're watching something, you're like, oh, there's this famous person. Everyone else sort of deflates in comparison because they haven't really been as drawn out. I don't know if that makes sense.
It does. And we used to joke about this, but you could find Eleanor Roosevelt almost anywhere. Like she was on the go for approximately 70 years nonstop. So you can place her at just about like any kind of institution. There are people who are really active, really well-traveled, prolific. W.E.B. Du Bois is also a great example of we can pick a random part of his life and then he's completely different when we look at another part of his life. The fact that he dies right before the March for Jobs and Freedom on Washington and he's not in Washington, he's in Ghana, tells you something, right? Like the trajectory of his activism has become really different from other people. I think the notable fact that he is in his 50s, he's at his peak intellectually in a lot of ways. He's just published Darkwater. He's already put out 2 of the most important histories, period, in the United States. And he invests his energy into children. No matter what your background is, that's so inspirational. You think about, you know, Valerie Tripp and Pleasant Rowland saying, we could do anything, right? We could get into a lot of fields, but we think that spending our time writing books for children is so valuable. We're going all in.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it's a hugely admirable choice. And I love a choice that puts in conversation Du Bois, Pleasant Rowland, and Valerie Tripp.
I don't know that they're, you know, as far apart as we might think, because it has not been a common human idea that you should invest a ton of energy, not just into children, period, but specifically into the creative minds of children. Like part of
Yeah.
where the whole fairyland aspect that Hughes also really develops in the Brownies book is the fact that a popular periodical consumed by white children had a segregated fairyland where African descended fairies were not allowed. And so this whole notion that like something as straightforward as that, Du Bois takes that and builds a whole world and a whole kind of creative outlet around it that we're still talking about. That's so important. This idea of like, well, children, like we're talking about mirrors and windows through literature, you know, the fact that they didn't have black fairies, like that is something that he wants to explore. Obviously, it's also symbolic of bigger problems, but knowing that children's creativity is so valuable to the future of society, that's a very particular product of his, I think.
I think it is a very particular product of his, and it's interesting to think about like that idea and what's happening today with like directed reading for kids and like concerns about like what kids can handle or like what must be censored, and you know, providing that space of imagination for kids to both see mirrors and windows for themselves. And I'm thinking about like the Brooklyn Public Library's choice to make it very easy to get a digital library card, which was designed for students in states where there is all this censorship, particularly queer and trans students and students of color who want to read histories that have been banned. And, you know, just kind of like wondering, like, what would Du Bois make of that? What would he make of our own times?
I think he'd be very inspired by the work that's happening in this book, but I think he'd be pretty horrified that with the pretty significant change in literacy rates that's happened in 100 years, there's still a lot of cultural illiteracy. And I'm not trying to make light of what has changed for the better, but the fact that there is so much access and that in theory, we could easily get the works of all of these amazing minds. But there are people who feel differently and are myopic or racist and want to prevent people. It just reaffirms the power of the text, right? You can dismiss it and say, well, you know, what's like the real value of a poem about fairyland? And then you remember Du Bois is the first generation of Black Americans who are born post-Civil War. Mm-hmm. They're the first people, right, who are born. He's born right after the 14th Amendment with certain kinds of freedoms, right, that still have to be really fought for. And that's part of why I love the Claudie character, because I think she's situated at such an important hinge point. She sees what her parents and now grandparents and great grandparents have gone through, and she invites you to consider, well, as an older person, does Claudie move to Detroit and meet someone like Melody? Do they cross paths, right? What would that look like? And if Julie Albright was handed a copy of Ebony Jr., what would she think about it?
Right. So many different paths crossing. Would Mary Ellen be banning books in a Florida library today? I don't know. But on that note, go ahead.
I laughed kind of. I mean, for me, one of the standout things of my childhood was my family loved to laugh at the Goofus and Gallant cartoons in highlights, because they were such over the top illustrations of like, quote, good behavior and bad behavior. Gallant is obviously perfect and Goofus is not. He's highly imperfect. And I happened to flip to a copy of Ebony Jr. where it was like very much the same kind of dynamic playing out, which just kind of shows you, you know, these like common themes among children's literature.
Yes. Forever may they wave.
Are you a Goofus or a Gallant?
I'm definitely a Goofus, you know.
You think?
I don't know. I mean, maybe I feel like a Goofus, but I'm really a Gallant. I don't know where you fall on that trajectory.
I mean, I was always just so horrified by Goofus because his goofs were so painfully ridiculous. But Gallant was also kind of a narc.
That's fair. I mean, I'm realizing now, like, I, you know, lauded children's book characters that other people were like, they were cautionary tales. Like, I thought Amelia Bedelia was really cool.
No.
And a friend of mine was like, no, she's like, she's an idiot who, like, doesn't pay attention. And I was like, okay, but I found, like, words confusing, you know, that sound the same. So at that age, so I was like, you know, she's, like, normalizing confusing night with night. Like, You know what I mean? Like, she made me feel better. But someone else was like, no, that's ridiculous. Like, she was an insane human being. And I'm like, damn, really?
She was too chaotic. I also did not care for the man in the yellow hat, who I now know is based on or was created by important people who survived the Holocaust. Curious George, too curious for me. Him and Clifford the big red dog needed to be...
What about Madeline?
Did not care for it.
See, I love Madeline.
Nightmares. I don't like to hear other people... that kind of dormitory situation.
That's fair.
Not for
I just
me.
think the art is beautiful. You know,
the art is beautiful. I don't want to visit there. I think if people are curious about this, go to the Library of Congress or check out this book, because I think you will be so fascinated by like the beauty of the visual of this 100-plus-year-old magazine that existed for girls like Claudie, and you will just appreciate even more how she was composed and made out of that world.
Absolutely. And this new book is physically so beautiful, and the pieces in it are really gorgeous, and, you know, just highly recommend. Share it with a young person in your life. You know, we enjoyed it. We had a great time with this. And next month you would say maybe this is a more moral text than maybe what we're going to next month. Although, you know, it probably is. I think, you know, in ways that we're only just realizing, the tabloid culture of the 2000s really shaped the stories that we were told about women in public life. And we're going to be doing a deep dive on that.
I'm pulling up the exact title so people want to read along. It's called Toxic. I believe I called it Toxic Women, but it's Toxic Women, Fame, and the Tabloid 2000s by Sarah Dittum.
Okay. Yes, I'm glad you remembered that title, because I sure did not.
It's bright pink.
Perfect. So thank you, everyone, for listening. And we so appreciate you in this community. And we will see you on our next episode. Thank you.